Good afternoon. My name is Gillian Balaban and I am Senior Coordinator Governance Relations at GRI. Welcome to this meeting of the Global Sustainability Standards Board, known by its acronym, the GSSB, held on 20 June 2024. This virtual meeting is being hosted from Amsterdam, the Netherlands. Please note that all public GSSB meetings are being recorded, and you can find the audio recording on the GSSB meeting webpage, along with high-level summaries of previous GSSB meetings. You can also find the slide deck to this meeting on the same page. Present from the GRI Secretariat today, Sebastian Butt, Chief of Standards, Manan Houchet-Boudet, Research Manager, Miguel Perez-Ludena, Research Lead, and Tamar Salstra, Senior Manager Standards. We are also joined by external guests, Dr. Jonathan Koleb and Anna-Marie Birdsey. We'll start with a roll call. Anna Nefedova.
Present.
Cordy Leroux is just joining. Chalandra De Silva.
Present.
Deborah Ng.
Present.
Galia Tsankova.
Present.
Ganga Charan Sharma.
Present.
Julia Genuadi.
Present.
Igazuma Okoroba.
Present.
Jeff Robertson.
Present.
Jennifer Prinsing.
Present.
Laura Dana Carter.
Present.
Peter Colley.
Hello.
Rebecca Coriat.
Instruction.
Present.
Tomu Machiba.
Present.
And GSSB Chair Carol Adams.
Present.
Thank you. I'll just go back to Corley LaRue.
Present.
Thank you, Corley. I will now hand over to the Chair, Carol Adams, to open the meeting.
Thank you, Gillian. Welcome to everybody, and thank you to the staff for the huge amount of work that's gone into the papers for this meeting, and of course to all the GSSB members for taking the time to read and consider them. The first thing to look at is the agenda here, and the first action is to approve the summary of the meeting held on the 16th of May 2024. Are there any issues regarding this summary that anybody wants to raise? I don't see any.
Carol, I did make a few, I think 3 corrections via email before the meeting. Do I need to go? Shall I go through them again?
Peter,
I didn't. Sorry.
Sorry, yes, they came into the Secretariat. I have passed your comments on and they have been updated in the summary, Peter.
Okay, I didn't see those, but were they in relation to how your role was described, Peter, by any chance?
One was that I was described as an advisory committee member when I'm the technical committee member. One was that I said the GSSB member from Deloitte advised that it would take years to build the capacity to report this data rather than it takes years to collect the data.
Okay.
And
yes.
Lines 88, 89, there was basically a correction to how Australia and Spain having higher rates of casual employment than other developed countries, and that in Japan, certain categories of work have very high average working weeks. And then lines 91, 92, we don't prescribe a methodology for determining living wage. The draft refers to methodologies that already exist.
Okay, thank you. And I had noted errors in the way your role was described on lines 14 and 78. It should be as a technical committee member.
Yep.
Tomu?
Yeah, just minor point, but Japan never have 80 hours per week working hours. It's even though people might work that long. It's 40 hours.
And where is the reference to that? Can you tell them where that needs to be corrected?
Which?
It was lines 88 to 89, which is what was my comments. I talked
Okay.
about the issue of
Yeah.
salary in the category of salary men, which is basically white collar professional men. Yes, the illegal hours are 40 hours a week, but there's a culture of high average working hours per week, of a lot more than 40 per week.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, given those amendments, then can we approve this summary of our previous meeting? Seeing no objections, I'll take those as approved. Thank you. And if we could go to item 4 on the agenda, this is a substitution for a member of the Standard Project for Economic Impact. Can we approve this change due to somebody not being in a position to take up the role now? Are there any objections? Okay, seeing none, I will take that as approved. Thank you. And then our next item is to hear from Jonathan and Anna. And I will hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I have the pleasure of kicking us off today. So my name is Anna Maria, or Annie Birdsley. I have been at the Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance, or DCAF, for about almost 12 years, working on responsible business conduct. And I'm wearing a sort of two hats today, as we have a strategic engagement with the International Committee of the Red Cross, the DCAF ICRC partnership that works on providing advisory support and tools and guidance to companies working in high-risk areas. And very quickly, you know, we just to set up the presentation a little bit, if we can go to the PowerPoint. There we go, perfect. Just to set up the presentation a little bit, you know, we're here to present a mapping study and recommendations report that we have commissioned together with Dr. Jonathan Kolyeb from the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, Business and Human Rights Centre. It's a mouthful, RMIT. But indeed, you know, to really as a supportive tool and constructive engagement with the GRI and GSSB to really support in understanding how companies can report more effectively on three issues of relevance to operating in conflict affected and high risk areas: on responsible security, on conflict sensitivity, and on respect for IHL. Next slide, please. So I think Nora and Harold would have circulated the report beforehand, but there it is again. If you wanted to scan and open it, we'll certainly circulate it again. If you can go to the next slide, and then I'll pass the floor to my colleague Jonathan to jump in as well. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Hi. Yeah. So let me just do a little bit of a personal introduction. I'm not from the International Committee of the Red Cross or the DCAF, the Geneva Centre for Security Sector Governance. I'm from RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia. So good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, depending on where you're tuning in from. In terms of this report, we're really excited about it, and again, I'd like to at the outset thank the GRI Secretariat members, Harold and Noura in particular, for their collaboration and openness to communicate on this topic. We're really excited about the project. We're really excited in the sense also for GRI. So the GRI mining sector standard that you just released earlier this year has a conflict affected and high risk areas topic, which I think really does advance the conversation in terms of the reporting framework and the expectations of the mining sector. And where we see this report as being positioned is that it's time for the GRI and sustainability officers to consider their impacts in conflict affected and high risk areas as being sector agnostic, that it's time for a sector agnostic standard and approach to how we report, and therefore how we behave as responsible and sustainable businesses in conflict-affected and high-risk areas. And we've, I think, for all three project partners, we've definitely taken a very collaborative approach. So none of the three project partners are here to chastise or berate. We're here to encourage, cajole, and offer our services and our expertise to get to, I think, what is a shared goal of more responsible and sustainable business practice in conflict-affected and high-risk areas. CARAs, if I may start calling it CARAs, it's not a niche topic. Depending on who you ask, and that's a question perhaps for Q&A, there is anywhere between 24 and 200 plus conflict-affected and high-risk areas around the world. I was at a high-level dialogue on business and human rights yesterday, organised by the UN Global Compact Network Australia, and over half the participants of business representatives suggested, without too much due diligence, that they are exposed to, either through their operations or their value chains, to CARAs. So the exposure to CARAs is widespread across many, many different sectors. And the GRI, to their credit, again, to GSSB's credit, many years ago integrated human rights into the notion of what is sustainable and responsible business practice and business reporting. The touchstone document in terms of respect for human rights amongst businesses is, of course, the United Nations Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights. That document itself says that governments and companies should pay extra special heed to their conduct in conflict-affected areas. Why? Because it is in those areas where the most egregious human rights abuses that companies are sometimes involved in occur. And so we should be prioritising our focus and our attention on this area. So that's the sort of the rationale, the genesis of this project, and we hope what we have done is not just, again, throw stones, if you will, or highlight holes in the current GRI set of sustainability standards, but also provide some practical, doable, feasible pathways to move the conversation forward as well. And we can come to the recommendations in a moment. Annie, next slide. Unless there's, well, here's one representation, perhaps, of the conflict-affected and high-risk areas, the CARAs, that at least one entity, the Geneva Academy, has listed. Every continent is represented, sadly. As we say, we joke in the business. Unfortunately, conflict resolution and conflict prevention is a growth industry at the moment. This is an issue that businesses are grappling with, and certainly over the last few years, some very high-profile hostilities, including the war between Russia and Ukraine, the hostilities and war in Israel and Gaza at the moment, but also in Myanmar and elsewhere, have really brought this consideration of what should a responsible business do in these regions. And we believe that reporting frameworks are valuable in providing not just virtue signaling, as I'm sure you'll agree, there is currency and heft to sustainability reporting, and it's one lever to create and make behaviour change. So we would urge the GSSB to consider our recommendations and the findings of the report.
Indeed, and if we can go to the next slide. There we go. Great, thank you. Indeed, and so I think, Jonathan touched on an important point there that, live conflicts is one thing, but also the high risk areas, the conflict affected side of it, which is, we get caught up often in categories, when DCAV seriously work with companies, because everyone wants very neat categories. But I think ultimately what we find in GRI reporting is the value of having companies reflect on their meaningful steps that they take to manage, these three elements of conflict affected and high risk areas. Notably conflict sensitivity, performing a conflict analysis, understanding root causes, consequences, and how the company's operations aggravate tensions or create tensions or impact peace building, responsible security management, which I think can be distilled down to the way that a company works with public and private security, and the GRI topic standard on security references training in particular, which I think is one element of human rights due diligence when it comes to security providers. But I think more broadly, security and human rights and conflict is really a feedback loop where non-security issues such as land and water, or issues of compensation and legacies from previous company projects may have security consequences, and vice versa. I think when that loop is reinforced when heavy security responses by security providers can exacerbate and contribute to inequalities and these types of grievances. So I think it's for us it's also not simply the security provider side, but the wider elements of the company's security arrangements throughout the supply chains. And finally, I think more critically to that element of armed conflict is the respect for international humanitarian law, and to understand how companies are implementing it or mindful of it, through their policies and processes, particularly when things go very, very crucial and live in high risk areas. I don't know, Jonathan, if you wanted to jump in on this, or if we can move to the next slide.
Yeah, no, I think these are beyond human rights concerns. These are the three main areas that over and above typical human rights concerns of companies that they should be mindful of. And that's after conducting a literature analysis and a review of other governance instruments like the voluntary principles, the OECD guidelines, the UN guiding principles, and others. We came to these three themes that should be foregrounded. Yep, next slide is fine. So the structure of the report, it really does, we can skip to the next slide if that's all right, is structured around three parts. First, the mapping and gap analysis, really just to analyse how is conflict sensitivity, respect for international humanitarian law, and responsible security management actually reflected in the existing GRI standards. So if a company wanted to report on it, are there opportunities already that are articulated, made explicit in the existing GRI standards? We should also note, of course, that the universal standards do incorporate human rights. Companies should be reporting about their management of human rights impacts. So it is there. There are opportunities there within the existing reporting framework of the GRI standards. However, we're a big believer if you don't name something and make it explicit, it sometimes gets missed. I think you'll, I hope, agree. Hence the reason why GRI has developed so many great topic standards. So part one is that the analysis. Part 2 and 3 really are the recommendations, are the practical side of this project, which again, we look forward to having a conversation with you about, but ideally we'd really love to have a conversation about how we can move them forward. Part 2 is indeed a supplementary guidance. So if there is a GRI reporting entity out there that wants to consider what is better practice or best practice when it comes to reporting on CARAs, they can do so right now by adopting this supplementary guidance. It's simply taking the existing GRI topic disclosures and adding, if you will, conflict questions. Additional conflict questions. that could be prompted within the existing standards framework. And then part 3 really is a recommendation that is squarely directed at the GSSB. We know that the GSSB has been considering how to push forward this idea of conflict, a conflict standard perhaps. And so we've tried to do some of that work for you. We've analysed what we consider as good practice when it comes to responsible business conduct and turned that into a blueprint, a skeleton, a shell, if you will, of a possible GRI topic standard that is sector agnostic on carers, very much leaning into the work that you've already done on the mining sector standard, but making it sector agnostic and really in line with the leading governance instruments that are out there as well. And so next slide, I think. Well, there you go. There's another QR code, another opportunity to download. So we've teased those out. And I mean, this might be a good opportunity to say, again, that supplementary guidance for reporting, it's got 3 logos on the bottom at the moment. We'd love there, to talk about the opportunity for that to be endorsed somehow, some way by the GRI itself, perhaps disseminated and distributed as just a useful tool to the companies that are already using the GRI standards. Certainly all our 3 organisations have been approached, especially over the last 18 months to 2 years, by companies that are asking, what should we be doing in carers? And so this would be a really valuable tool for your clientele already, the community of GRI reporting entities. Next slide. I might take a sip of my tea.
Well, maybe just
go on. Sorry.
No, just to say, to give Jonathan a voice a break. I think we're across the world. We're having weird weather, so we're all sort of on the verge of developing a flu. But indeed, one of the key elements that the study has undertaken is this mapping of looking at the various standards and identifying where do these references exist and where there are opportunities. Now, this screenshot is quite small, but the study obviously has the full image, and we've identified, strong opportunities across where companies using part 2, which is a supplementary guidance, can start teasing out and also eventually implementing indicators on these subjects.
Yeah. And next slide. It's just a screenshot of exactly what we're talking about. So we know that the GRI has done a similar study with UNICEF around children's rights previously, developing a supplementary guidance for those companies that want to, in particular, pay attention to children's rights in their reporting. This is a very similar type of product. So on the left are the existing disclosures, completely unaltered from the GRI standards. And then on the right-hand side column, just those extra carers related questions or reporting elements that could and should be considered by reporting entities. So we hope that's a useful tool. Next slide, please. And then again, this is just a screenshot to demonstrate what we've tried to do shape around 8 key disclosures, 8 key best practice or good practices when it comes to responsible business conduct in conflict-affected and high-risk areas. We've tried to turn those good practices into disclosure requirements, trying to emulate the GRI tone, style, and framework. And we hope again that this is not the end of a conversation. We're certainly not trying to, foist this lock, stock, and barrel upon you, but perhaps opening of a conversation and as a starting point from which we can build upon as well. I'll throw to Annie for the next slide.
Yes, thank you. So indeed, I mean, I think, we we've acknowledged, I think, the significant work that GRI has done already on the topic. I think also we want to acknowledge that we're keenly aware of, we're not fully aware, but we do have an awareness of the, dynamics of your stakeholders and, the elements of consensus that are required, and also the long process that decisions such as developing a new standard or creating guidance may entail in the GRI and GSSB, and so we and particularly the build-up and the sort of sensitization and the need to kind of one, present the business case, two, not dump yet another round of reporting requirements on companies who are sort of feeling perhaps trying to make sense of existing standards. And so those two elements of building understanding and building awareness, and also promoting the utility and the usefulness of this type of reporting as a meaningful way for companies to reflect and be transparent on these key on these high risk areas. For us, we just wanted to ensure that we'd love to play a supporting role in that. So indeed, wider awareness raising or joint events or engagements with the GRI and you folks are most welcome. I think Jonathan mentioned as well, joint promotion or endorsement of the supplementary guidance to promote also, existing use and existing putting a conflict lens to the existing standards. And then, potentially the development of a new topic standard. We've heard that there is a review of the GRI 412 on security practices, that perhaps that may or could become something around conflict sensitivity, respect for HL, and responsible security to kind of bundle things. So certainly we'd love to be engaged and support that, and indeed more widely, I think. In terms of the wider engagement, we had a great session at the OECD Forum on responsible mineral supply chains. I think those kind of conversations those sort of events that drive the conversation forward are really needed to advance that shared goal. And so we're here and we'd love to have a good debate on it. So maybe we leave some time for questions as well. Or I don't know, Jonathan, if you'd like to have the last word on the presentation.
No. No, go for it. Looking forward to any questions.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan and Annie. And I'm quite sure that no one here would see this as throwing stones. On the contrary, I think it's very helpful to get this kind of expert input and consideration into the work we do. Does anybody have any comments or questions? Igazuma.
Right. Thanks, Jonathan and Annie, and thanks, Carol. I think the report is very insightful, but I was hoping you could perhaps elaborate more on the boundaries or perhaps the limits of conflict sensitivity. When you say that it's important for, conflicts to be named, and I think it's your 8th recommendation. If you have thought about the boundaries where these conflicts are basically or majorly under the purview, securities under the purview of the state, and on the side of the victims of the conflict or the communities that are on the receiving end of the conflicts, there are legacy issues that are cultural or perhaps traditional, and business is in the middle of this. And sometimes you have these security issues that first need to be communicated responsibly by the state, and where you do not have a responsible communication of the state, I wonder if you think about the boundaries of business doing that communication via reporting. So I think conflict sensitivity goes both ways. You have to think about communicating, reporting conflict sensitively as business, as an enterprise, where you have a state taking a different approach. So I'm just wondering what the boundaries of conflict sensitivity in the reporting would be in line with your recommendation 8.
Right. So certainly, thank you for the question, Annie, and sorry, Igazuma, and Annie. Please feel free to chime in. I think you've touched on a really sensitive issue when it comes to, in general, corporate human rights reporting. That there are sensitive issues, and sometimes companies don't want to get ahead of relevant external stakeholders, be it governments, be it other folks in their operational on their operational horizons. That's something to work through. What the UN guiding principles say, and what the leading governance instruments around responsible business conduct say, is that whether or not governments are acting or not acting, that doesn't absolve the company themselves of their responsibilities to respect human rights, and in the context of CARAs, we would argue to adopt a conflict-sensitive approach. That's been endorsed by the OECD guidelines and the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. So all we are suggesting here is that there should be, if they are already conducting that, they should be reporting about it. Of course, the practicalities, I absolutely acknowledge that there are sensitivities, political sensitivities, social sensitivities around that, and that needs to be worked through. But I don't think that that is unique to the CARAs situation.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a larger conversation to be had. Certainly in Australia, for example, there's talk of companies that are holding back on reporting on climate and environmental issues as well as human rights because of the fear of litigation or reputational costs if they, put a foot wrong. So that's something that the whole industry, I think, is lots of industries are grappling with.
Mm-hmm. And I think also, indeed, I think, as you said, Jonathan, that business involvement in sort of peace process, security sector governance, governance issues, it is sensitive. But I think in terms of a prevention mindset and preventing that the company's impacts on existing tensions, or as you say, legacy issues, that that it aggravates and then it creates further issues. I think in terms of also the business case for the company, that this is I think quite strong. And I know that you're coming from a company that I think operates in Nigeria, and just to draw on a perhaps relevant example, in Nigeria, DCAF works with in-country working groups on business and human rights that are led by local Nigerian civil society, and there different companies participate in the working groups, and they're focused around the voluntary principles among other initiatives as well. But there, for example, part of the conflict sensitivity sort of engagements in that working group, which then could very well be reported in these sustainability reports and GRI index reports, is the efforts of companies to have agreements with public security that's assigned to their operational sites, and there's always challenges with signing MOUs with public security, but as part of that, yes, that is a key example of conflict sensitivity, is having agreements on human rights with the security that's assigned or operating around your site, and is not necessarily something that is political necessarily, or it depends on the context. But I think that there's a lot that companies can report on. There's a lot that companies are doing already that somehow doesn't make it into a conflict sensitive, that they don't themselves recognize that that's what they're doing, or it could be amended or tweaked, or it could be sort of framed in a way where then it really encapsulates that goal. So I think, just to leave it there, but I hope that answered your question.
Right. So I really think that is a conversation to be built on, and that's the basis of my feedback, because there's always going to be that blur area, and businesses really want a tool. We receive the training and we receive all the guidelines and the ideas, but you've had a very strong ICRC, and then the Remet University. I was would really be looking to see, if there is some improvement or some tool that really helps business, understand the boundaries, because there's a lot of self-help and interpretations of conflict sensitivity. So I guess this is just feedback to continue the engagement and the conversations, obviously.
Thank you.
Sorry.
If I could come in here, because we really don't have any slack in the agenda today, unfortunately. We've got a very full agenda. Chalendra has a question to raise, and I think we can take it as given that this will be a resource that is used by topic standard technical committees as they're developed. They draw on a range of resources. So I see no reason why this wouldn't be one of them, as relevant topic standards are updated and revised. In terms of joint communication, I think we'll maybe have to come back to that and take a recommendation from the standards division on that at a later date. Chalendra.
Thanks, Carol. Jonathan, just a very quick question for me to get my mind around it. When you say a CARA or the conflict area, do we consider the potential of tensions, of communal tensions in there as well, or are we talking about an actual conflict?
Yeah, no. So the former. So one of the things that we wanted to do, and again, this is language that's been adopted already by the GRI mining sector, by the European Union, and to a lesser extent by the World Bank, is that violence occurs on a spectrum. We shouldn't wait for an armed conflict to be declared by some third party entity before we take action. As Annie mentioned before, it's very much a preventative approach, right? Conflict sensitivity. Human rights risk assessment is also about preventing human rights abuses. That's certainly what we should be doing here with reporting. We see reporting as a lever, as a tool to educate internally in reporting entities, reporting companies, and make behaviour change. So CARAs, though, is ill-defined, Chalendra. So as I said, the European Union maintain a list. I think they've got about 24 CARAs listed on their list. If you look at someone like the Heidelberg Institute, they have over 100 armed conflicts. My advice when I provide advice to companies is go with your gut and don't wait for the lawyers to tell you that it's a conflict zone. What CARAs is all about is preventing your business from being caught up in egregious human rights abuses. So it's a win for your company. It's a win for the people on the ground to be conducting that type of conflict sensitivity, responsible security management, and respect for IHL.
Hey, thank you very much indeed for your for putting this to us, for your work on it. There's clearly a lot of important issues here. Perhaps we could have a further discussion on it in our next in-person meeting. And in the meantime, if anybody has any feedback that they want to send through via the GSSB Secretariat, then please do so. But in the meantime, Annie and Jonathan, thank you very much indeed for your work on this and bringing this to us.
Thank you for the opportunity to hear us out. Thank you.
Yes, thank you indeed. And, please be in touch and we'll be happy to discuss further.
Thank you.
So I guess we'll drop out of the call then. And
yes, thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
And so now I'm going to hand over to Manon and Miguel. I've seen various iterations of this paper. I think it's looking very good. It's clearly been a lot of work, so I will hand over to you and to talk us through what you really want us to focus on here.
Thank you, Carol. I'm going to bring some context to the GSSB members to remind them why are we talking about this now. I believe the next slide explains it. There is a combination of internal and external factors. I mean, first, the broader tendency, we see that reporting becomes mandatory for publicly listed companies and some large private companies, there is relatively less pressure on the public sector. We see a gap there. And indeed, we know that there are many public sector organizations that report using GRI, but their adoption rate is relatively significantly lower than private companies. And mind you, the public sector is almost half of GDP in advanced economies. So meaning there is an important gap here. The second point is that we saw that many national and international organizations for the public sector are becoming interested in impact reporting. The most important is the SASB project to develop a standard for climate reporting for the public sector, a project that is running this year and in which GRI is collaborating to ensure consistency and alignment as much as possible with the GRI standards. And finally, the internal point is that this issue was brought up by in the GSSB a couple of years ago. Many of you were not yet in GSSB, so there was a question: why is there no public sector among the list of 40 sectors that will be developed by the sector program? And well, there was no obvious answer. The public sector is a bit special, so we agreed to produce a research document that will analyze the situation and give some recommendations. And this is the paper that we are presenting today. Is item 3 in your documentation, and Manon has 2 slides to remind you of the key points.
Thank you, Miguel. Yeah. So based on this request from the GSSB, we went ahead and did some research on reporting in the public sector. And so we based our main findings on literature review, as well as analysis of reports by a public sector organization using GRI. And so I'm going to go through the main finding quickly. So as Miguel mentioned, the public sector is such a big part of the economy that if we don't incentivize public sector organization reporting, then we miss sustainable, like very important part of sustainable impact. So we try to understand a little bit why this might happen. And one of the things that came up pretty early in the research is that there is still a perception among public sector organization that the GRI standards are only for the private sector. And this is due, one of the things that came back often was that the vocabulary and the wording used in the standard was still quite focused on private sector, so things like supply chain or business partners. And then we identified that there were 2 main challenges in terms of reporting for public sector organization. First of all, the fact that many of their impact comes from rules and regulation that they dictate. So this would be, for example, let's say policies or of regulations that they apply on a jurisdiction. So not all public sector organizations have this power, but a lot of them have. And it means that where they have their own impact as an organization, for example, the greenhouse gas emissions that they produce in their buildings, but also if they enact policies to try to reduce GHG emission for citizens or for businesses, this reduction will also be something that is material to them because they contributed to it. And then it's also linked to this first point, is that they have unique mechanism of accountability, especially in terms of reporting on what they do. So for example, a ministry or a government will report to a parliament on the type of action that they are taking. And so they are very used to this form of reporting, which are not necessarily really aligned with the type of reporting that GRI is proposing, or rather that they are not used to use this type of standards. And we also observed that there are many types of reporting currently within the public sector. And GRI is part of it, but also we saw that reporting according to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, was very frequent because it's really linked to the way that public sector organizations plan their work in the first place. So next slide, please. So this led us to come up with 5 recommendations that can be taken either all together or separately. And today we would particularly like to hear which recommendations you think are the most relevant and the most sort of should take priority. So the first one is to consider the public sector's perspective in GRI standard development and other GRI activities. So this is mainly, and we already do it to a certain extent, to involve public sector representative in our working groups, our technical committees, or to interview them as experts as well, to really make sure that we can also present the perspective of public sector organization when we design the standards. There is also a point around changing a little bit the terminology of the constituency, which is currently business enterprises and other reporters, to acknowledge that public sector's organization are part of our intended group of reporters. The second recommendation is around developing a standard on the public sector that would focus on general government. And this particularly would take into account the need of the general government in terms of reporting on their policies. We also have a recommendation that relates to developing standards for industries where the public sector is predominant. So there are a few sectors where the public sector is almost as a monopoly, but mostly there are a lot of sectors that we are already planning to work on where the public sector has a very important share. So that would be things like utilities, for example, or education or healthcare. We would also recommend to encourage policy and regulatory reporting in conjunction with operational impact reporting. So that's what I explained earlier around the fact that public sector organizations are used to report on their policy and regulatory impact. And right now, doing it with GRI can lead to some challenges. And the last point is around increased engagement with the public sector, and it goes beyond maybe the mandate of the GSSB, but it would be really to improve communication towards and with public sector organization to really communicate this message that GRI standards are also for them, and maybe to develop resources such as GRI academic course, for example, to help them really get involved with the standards. So that's the end of our presentation. And as I said, we would really like to hear your views on these recommendations.
Many thanks indeed for that. So let's start with recommendation 1. The issue of broadening out the business enterprises reporter constituency was something I did touch on with the supervisory board a couple of meetings ago. They weren't, I mean, they feel that the business enterprises constituency is very important, didn't particularly want to add another dimension to that, but were open to looking at a separate public sector constituency. So I wanted to give you that background before hearing your views on recommendation 1. So perhaps it's easier to ask further all. Does anybody have a view on broadening out the business constituency to include the public sector? Let's take that option first of all. Loredana.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, it's more of a general comment, but it touches upon recommendation number 1. I was a bit perplexed, to say the least, by the paper and the recommendations there. I thank Miguel and Manon for their work. This is really extremely detailed, and this is extremely useful. I was just wondering whether these efforts are really where we should. I mean, this is really where we should direct our efforts at the moment. Some of the points of the recommendations I would agree with. Others I would be more cautious about, for the following reasons, if I may, Carol.
Yes, sure. Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, of course. I mean, we know that organizations mean private and public sector organizations for GRI standards, but I do feel like there's already kind of a full set of standards and international rules applying to governments, applying to public sector organizations that are actually hard law, which means that they do have to report on them as well, and there are sanctions attached to their non-compliance. Whereas for the private sector, there's not much at the international level at the moment, and this is what GRI standards are about, just to create a level playing field there and to create some reporting obligations for the private sector. So I was a bit surprised to see so many recommendations for the public sector where there's already a lot of constraining rules for this sector. And so I was also, I thought that it was also interesting to see that the paper highlighted the difference in objectives of private and public sectors, which is exactly what I wanted to highlight as well, that the public sector has a public interest and common interest, general interest at heart, whereas the private sector is for profit. So there's also a big gap in terms of how we can encompass those very diverging objectives into our work, and I think that it's going to create a lot of issues, in my view, for our work there. And yeah, basically, also a few of the topics that were mentioned are actually sovereign powers of the state, which I don't think we should be touching. I saw in the paper public order. This is not something that I think we should be even considering as a topic. Health and education, I would also be very cautious about this. Again, those are sovereign powers of the state, although they are also used. They're also serviced by the private sector, but I haven't exactly fully. Let's just mature my thoughts on this, but I would be very cautious about this whole enterprise. That being said, there are a few recommendations here that I think are really useful and we could implement quite easily. I'm not sure about the big ambitious ones that are mentioned here. Thank you.
Thank you. I suppose this all came about because there it was a request from the GSSB in the first place, knowing that there is a very low level of sustainability reporting across the public sector, and it has a huge impact. Igazuma.
Thank you, Carol. And I want to thank Perez and the team for the great work. Initially, I wanted to understand why there was a need for this study, but that has been established now. So yes, I do think that there would be cases where public sector need references, but this request was made quite a while ago. So I'm wondering that with the push for regulatory sustainability reporting, I'm wondering whether that need is same as the reason why we conducted the research. But more specifically to the recommendation number 1, I think it would be better to leave the business enterprises as it is rather than expanding, because the context is so different, and I think it might lead to diluting some of the requirements that we really want to hold private sector accountable for. So I would just prefer that, if we're considering a separate standard, or, but not to combine it with a business enterprise. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any, Jennifer?
Hi. Yeah, my comment will be fairly short and aligned there. That the business enterprise constituency, I don't believe is suitable to combine with the public sector constituency. Very different stakeholders, very different objectives, very different mechanisms for making decisions and taking action. So whether or not we need to consider the public sector perspective, I don't believe it should be as part of an expansion of the business constituency. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Tomu?
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much for all the work. And I remember 20 years ago when we, developed the sector supplement for the public sector. There were several, government entities who are pretty much kind of active in the disclosure. Especially, I remember Australia and New Zealand. And I see now it's bit of, fashion is going down, then more focus on SDGs. So, if we go for the public sector reporting, first, we should have, like-minded public sector entities and who are keen on doing this. And secondly, more SDG-based reporting is quite, universal now. So something we should be able to add value to it, and as a supplementary kind of guidance, let's say, at least, like guidance on how to utilize existing GRI standards for the public sector like this. It's not kind of separate standards we are developing.
Okay, thank you. There has been a lot of research just to reinforce this, that there are various different guidelines for different public sector organizations in different parts of the world, which draw on bits of GRI standards. But some of the indicators are somewhat different. And so this is to bring some consistency also to the reporting that is out there and make it possible for public sector organizations and different levels of government to draw on the GRI standards and bring some more consistency to that reporting. So I don't see any support for expanding the business organizations constituency. So there's a question mark still around whether we would recommend adding a public sector constituency. And I guess part of the issue here is that we don't already have the public sector represented to have a voice on this. I wonder if this is a conversation that could be taken up through Jeff with the Stakeholder Council also, and get some views from them. Are there any other views on whether we consider adding a public sector constituency or make that proposal? It's not our decision, but it would be a proposal that we would make. And the supervisory board were favourably disposed to considering this. Kalendra.
Carol, I just was thinking if there in the scenario that there is a public sector constituent representative, and given the complete divergent or somewhat divergent objectives of the private sector and the public sector, like what Laura mentioned, would that result in that public sector representative or the constituent representative being more or less out of focus when the rest of the with the rest of the work, because most of the standards are focused around the private sector, and would that, I'm just thinking that person or that constituent representative will probably not have much input to make, given that 99% or 95% of the work would be based on the private sector.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, it could be that the standards were presented in a way. I mean, the proposal here is talking about different language that's used in the public sector. So not necessarily. Miguel, did you want to say something there?
Yes, thank you. It's precisely as Carol said. I mean, to ensure that all our standards bring in inclusive terminology and language, which indeed, as Chulendra made a point, is true that most of them do, and probably you could have a topic standard on pollution, of which public sector organizations have no issues at all. But we have identified in the paper certain issues in which the public sector do have some issues, regarding economic performance, regarding topics like corruption or lobbying, in which sometimes they are confused of the terminology and of the perspective that is used. So we believe that such a public sector representatives would go very much in line with the rest of all other constituencies in most topics, and would add a different perspective in only a selection of the topic.
Indeed.
By the way, this is the experience already in the working group of the economic impacts project, in which there is a representative from GSSB.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Miguel. Tommy? Tommy, you're on. Yep, there you are. You're on mute.
Hi, sorry about this. And I think at least, it's worth consulting, public sector representatives like ICRE or GCON, because of so many, like local governments, it's now declaring the carbon neutral for 2050, for instance. And there are quite momentum of making, public sector or like region or cities more sustainable and the carbon neutral as well. So it's good. At least, I think it's we can ask kind of those entities whether they are, they have an interest or not.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Now, some of these recommendations here are things that relate to the work plan going forward, and can be considered and put in into updates of the work plan by the Standards Division for our consideration. The increased engagement with the public sector has, I think, been happening anyway through our conversations with GSSB, which is the International Public Sector Accounting Standards Board, which is now talking about setting sustainability reporting standards. And so there has been some engagement with them. And that will no doubt continue. But I guess the first recommendation is really the key one, which would move this forward to ensure that the standards that we are developing can be used by both the private and public sector. Many of the disclosures already are used by the public sector and incorporated into guidelines, but public sector sustainability reporting is at a very low level, as Miguel's report highlights clearly, and it is an area where this could be stepped up. So, would anybody have? Does anybody have any strong views opposing asking for further consideration, and this would be by the Stakeholder Council and the Supervisory Board, for there to be a stakeholder constituency for the public sector to increase the relevance of our standards?
Carol, I'll just make the obvious, Peter here.
Yeah.
There are the concerns that Loredana raised, and that'll take. We don't really have the capacity to resolve them here, but there's significant issues that she's raised. On the issue of constituency representation, the obvious issue is always what's the optimal size of the GSSB, and what happens to the other constituencies if a new constituency is added. That's the juggling act that's involved in seeking to incorporate a new stakeholder constituency to the GSSB. So yeah, difficult juggling.
Indeed it is, Peter, and that, I guess, that would be something that would have to be considered as a second point if we made the decision to recommend, consider further adding a public sector stakeholder constituency. And I think the danger of not doing it is that more standards, a separate set of standards and separate guidelines will continue to be developed by different areas of the public sector in different countries, which use bits of GRI but are not completely aligned with it. So that is the danger of not doing so. Loredana.
Sorry, thank you. But Peter actually expressed it way better than I would have. I had a question about indeed the constituency and how it would look like. But I'm mindful also that states governments are already reporting, as Miguel and Manon rightly highlight in their report. They're already reporting under the SDGs. The SDG will continue on with another version, another iteration of it. They will in 2030. I see you. I see you shaking your head, Carol. Please tell me.
Well, I have, from my own research, there is a very low level of sustainability reporting across public sector organizations. And Miguel's and Manon's research is aligned with that. And all the research that they've looked at also shows a low level of reporting on social and environmental issues across public sector organizations.
Okay. Well, as I said before, I think the issue here is broader. It's about the lack of any regulation at the international level for private sector, where there is already a lot of regulation, hard law, not soft law as GRI standards, hard law that is applying to governments and their organizations and entities. And this is why I think there's already a lot out there. And it doesn't necessarily require a specific focus in that regard. I do think there are some value to trying to combine or join or alienate some of our initiatives there. But beyond that, I'm really thinking there's already a framework. But that's just my opinion there.
Miguel, could I ask you to come in on this question of regulation around sustainability accountability for public sector organizations? Loredana is questioning whether there is already regulation requiring accountability for sustainability impacts by public sector organizations. So could you respond to that, please?
Well, we didn't identify any global standard or anything approaching a standard. What we did see is that the public sector has its own accountability mechanisms, which are significantly different from the private sector. But that, in our opinion, doesn't preclude that there are impacts of these organizations that are not being reported, and that sustainability reporting, be it through GRI or through any other mechanism, would improve that accountability. I can understand also Loredana's point as an issue of priorities of the GSSB, which indeed it's a substantive one, given our resources constraint. But we haven't identified a global mechanism for accountability for the public sector as such.
Thank you. And can I ask now? Sorry, yes, Deborah.
Sorry, I just want to add. I mean, I think as an investor, we have done a lot of sort of partnerships or investments with public sector businesses for infrastructure assets. And my observation is that the regulations are all over the place, and many of them have not kept up with standards from today. And there is a general, we've always had pushback from partners, being the government, when asking for information on, sustainability, on impacts, on normal reporting that we need to do on our assets. So I do think that there is a place to put more pressure on public sectors to provide that information, because most of them would say, well, we're not regulated to provide that, so we won't give that. We won't provide that information. So I think there's a little bit of, yes, there's regulations, Loredana, but I don't think it's even and up to date across all different jurisdictions and states. So
thank you for that. Given the time that we have is very limited, we are really pushed for time, very busy agenda today. I'm going to ask just to get a sense check here on whether people think there is merit in pursuing the question of adding a stakeholder constituency for the public sector for further consideration. The question of what that means for the balance of stakeholder constituencies is a secondary consideration. But first of all, and that's not on the agenda for today, but can I ask for a show of hands? If you could either physically raise your hand or put your use your hand on the on Zoom, if you are in favour of adding a stakeholder constituency for the public sector.
And Carol, if I may just jump in, sorry, are we in favor of having the stakeholder council and the supervisory board consider that addition? Or are we in favor? Okay.
Yes, that's it. So it's not our decision. This is a decision that would need to go through the stakeholder council and the supervisory board. So can I ask those in favour to raise their hands? And those opposed?
I'm not opposed. I think it needs more work. I wasn't expecting a yes and no vote on this at this meeting. I'm an abstention at the moment.
Okay, so what more do you need then from the to be able to make a view on this?
Well, at the pragmatic mechanical level, I do want to understand how it affects the other constituency on the GSSB and whether we're actually going to expand the GSSB or keep it the same size and cut other constituencies. I think that's actually not a secondary issue. I think it's actually an important one. So that's at the practical mechanical level. And then at the broader methodology level, it's the issue about the issues that Loredana's raised about whether the public sector is already facing significant or substantial regulation in this area, or whether sustainability reporting is actually the big new area that it should lift its game in. I can see both sets of arguments. I'm just wasn't ready to.
Okay, thank you. So I can see some of this is covered in your paper already, Miguel. But I think if you could come back and address these specific questions that have been raised today in perhaps a separate paper, that would be very helpful, because it would be a shame if the standards were not being used by the public sector because of things that could easily be fixed. Anna.
Yes, quick question from me on the role the public sector plays in other standard developments. Do we have examples in financial standards? Anything else that we can use previous experience and see how governments participate?
Yes, so there is the International Public Sector Accounting Standards Board, which does set standards, and perhaps we need to include in a paper a bit more context about how that organization works in terms of the financial reporting, Miguel. Mm-hmm. And what their efforts have been to date on sustainability reporting, because it would be a shame for another set of standards to be developed for the public sector when there are already some that could quite easily be used for the public sector, if we made them a bit more public sector friendly. And that's what we're possibly looking at this point in time. Corley.
Thanks, Carol. Yeah, I mean, I agree with the comments that have been made. To me, the recommendations are kind of a range of things that one could do, whereas adding them to the stakeholder bodies is quite an extreme one, which might explain some of the hesitancy to jump right into that recommendation. I certainly don't think that we should shelf the whole initiative. I think it's important that we bear in mind the role that GRI it can play in also serving the public sector, given their impact as very well set out in the report. I was in a webinar this morning around the IFRS sustainability standards, and the question did come up about whether there would be standards for public sector companies, particularly in relation to financial reporting as well. So, one could conceive an environment where that does develop, whether that is through the Public Sector Accounting Standards Board or another body. But I think it would be very useful for us to continue exploring the role that GRI could play and balancing that with resource requirements. So within the range of recommendations, I think we should consider what is the sweet spot perhaps to start. I think increasing engagement is a good one to start exploring, looking potentially at interoperability or kind of mapping exercises. I think those are things that one could explore, which may help inform the need for then looking at involving them on a more formal basis as a stakeholder body.
Okay, thank you. So if the standards division then could address some of these particular questions, and particularly the one around the context at the moment for standards for the public sector around sustainability and the specific issues with our standards for being used by the public sector, perhaps detailing some of the guidelines that are already out there and how they map, or roughly, not in detail, to how they compare with the GRI standards. And if we could have a paper for consideration at our in-person meeting, then we will have more time to look at it. But otherwise, continue, I would suggest, with the the current engagements that you're working on. Everybody happy with that? Okay, then if we could move on. Thank you very much, Miguel and Manon. If we could then move on to the project for pollution, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Carol. Nice to see you again. So I will present a bit more of an elaborated scope. As you may remember, in the meetings of March and January, we discussed and approved or you discussed and approved the project proposal for a topic standards project for pollution, but with the understanding that a more detailed scope would be presented to the GSSB, and that is what we will be doing today. I will be doing. So just a quick background information on pollution and the pathway of pollution. For the projects, we will look at human activities and not natural sources, but human activities, and specifically activities by organizations, and looking at the operations, products and services. And this is, of course, inspired by the OECD guidelines. And also, perhaps good to mention is that we will focus on the emissions of primary pollutants. And on the next slide, look at the structure that we're proposing for the pollution projects and for pollution disclosures. It was identified that pollution is already present in some standards. For example, GRI 303, organizations can use that to report on water discharge, which might include pollutants. And then for critical incident management or critical incidences, it was discussed in the previous GSSB meeting that a critical incident could lead to pollution, but it might not. So we're proposing to draft an independent disclosure on that. And then eventually these bits and bobs will be included in one or more standards. And there will be a future project as well on circularity and material resource, and that will look at the revision of GRI 301 and 306. So these are some of the standards that are relevant to look at when it comes to the topic of pollution, and organizations for the full reporting on pollution might also reference these. Of course, for biodiversity, GRI 101 that was published earlier this year, pollution is a driver for biodiversity loss. Another example is that if there's a critical incident, it could also impact local communities, it could impact workers. So standards for OHS and local communities or indigenous people might also be relevant. So they might be referenced in the standards or disclosures that we will develop. The feedback that we received before the presentation today, we asked the GSSB members to provide feedback, and one of the issues that was mentioned was with respect to pollutants, whether they would include nuisance pollutants such as noise, odor, and vibrations. And indeed, these were mentioned in the project proposal, but also in the elaborated scope that might be considered to be included in the disclosures. And well, there are some references that are relevant that were identified for this as well. So they will not be forgotten. With respect to ozone depleting substances, one of the GSSB members remarked that mentioned that there is indeed phasing out of these disclosure of these substances. So, for example, in the Montreal Protocol, there are some of these substances that are already 100% phased out, but others will not last, not be phased out until 2030 or 2047 even. So there's still a relevance to include them in the project. Then there was a comment on target audience of the chapeau. I like this term quite a bit. Chapeau, so the white paper or the guidance or the standards interpretation that we were proposing to develop. So who is the target audience of it? And a distinction was made between reporters and users of reports. And I believe this distinction is quite relevant, as they might have a different need or a different perspective on what they would expect from this. There was also a comment made on to include other linked disclosures. For example, disclosure 227, compliance with laws and regulation from GRI 2, but also GRI 416, customer health and safety, was proposed to include. So I can include them in the proposed scope. And lastly, comments were made with respect to the demarcation between topic standards project for pollution and for circularity and material resources. And of course, in the chapeau, we will reference both, and I think where exactly one starts and the other ends and starts, right? We need to find that out during the development of the project. As circularity is an approach to manage pollution. So these were some of the comments that were made. And then for my last slide, we kindly request inputs from the members. So any observations on the elaborated scope? Our next step will be to present the work and open it up to experts, and a call for experts for the working group so that we can start the work. And I propose to add this elaborated scope as an annex for information for people. Then secondly, I would kindly like to ask you if you have any recommendations for key stakeholders for engagement. And lastly, I'm happy to announce that we have found 2 sponsors to the project. So it's Anna Nevadova and Rebecca Correa, who said that they would like to be sponsors. So I'm very happy with that news. That was all.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed for that. And thank you for your updated paper. Is everybody happy now with this this updated scope, taking into account our previous comments? Anybody have any concerns? No. Okay, I think we can take it that we are happy then. And any recommendations on key stakeholders to engage in this? Perhaps you could, if you do have any, you could send those in by email rather than give names over the recorded meeting. Thank you. Does anybody have any other points they want to raise on this matter? Well, thank you very much. That was very nice and quick. And thank you to Anna and Rebecca for putting themselves forward to be sponsors for the project. That's fantastic. Is there any other business that anybody has for the public session before we close the public session and go into the private session? No. Okay, thank you very much. So we will close the public session, Gillian, and move into our private session.